Good afternoon, everyone. The meeting will come to order. I'd like to welcome you to the regularly scheduled meeting of the Land Use and Transportation Committee. My name is Supervisor Malia Cohen. I'm the chair of this committee, and to my left is Vice Chair Supervisor Jane Kim, and Supervisor Wiener will be joining us shortly. Our clerk is the lovely and talented Miss Andrea Osbury. I also would like to recognize Jonathan Gumwalk and Charles Krimenak, who will be televising this broadcast for us at SFGov TV. Madam Clerk, good afternoon. Do you have any announcements for us today?
Yes, please silence all electronic devices. Completed speaker cards and copies of any documents to be included as part of the file should be submitted to the clerk. Items acted upon today may appear on the April 7, 2015 Board of Supervisors agenda unless otherwise stated.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Could you please call item number 1?
Yes, item number 1 is a hearing of the Interagency Plan Implementation Committee Annual Progress Report and Development Impact Fee Report.
All right, thank you very much. Colleagues, I'm the sponsor of this particular item. This is a hearing that I requested largely because every year the Planning Department produces a report on the work of the Interagency Planning Committee, which is a collection of city agencies that work together to fund and implement the designated infrastructure improvements within our neighborhoods and within the planned areas. The work is especially critical at times like the ones we are in now, where we're experiencing a significant amount of housing construction and growth. I have repeatedly for years said that the city has not lived up to its end of the bargain. It has stuck neighbors. It has bargained. Sorry, my notes are out of order. So we've set up a system where we know there would be a funding gap in the city to fill. From my perspective, it's in dealing with the Eastern Neighborhoods Plan. We are over 6 years in, and we are just starting to have a grasp of the financial hole that we're in. And I know, Supervisor Kim, you've asked some very smart questions around the Eastern Neighborhood Plan, so I think we're going to have a good discussion. Our city is growing. Our city needs to continue to grow, and these neighborhoods represent a great opportunity to accommodate this growth. However, we can't expect residents to accept growth and not fund the parks and transit and streetscape improvements that are needed to help make this growth manageable as well as livable. And we can't continue to bury our heads in the sand and wait for the market to begin to slow down so that our internal city process can begin to catch up. San Franciscans are smarter than that, and I believe that we have not been doing everything that we can to get the infrastructure that we need built in the neighborhoods. So I've called for this hearing largely because I believe the coordination around this infrastructure development is absolutely essential to our collective efforts to build more housing as well as affordable housing in our city. I also think that our discussion on this item will inform the next item on our calendar. I want to bring up the Planning Department staff who are here to go over their report and share with us some of the new approaches that they're taking to address these issues. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Kirsten Dissinger from Planning Department staff. Here for the Interagency Plan Implementation Committee, or like what we call it, IPIC for short, the IPIC report. I also want to mention another report, which is the Development Impact Fee Report, which the Controller's Office reports out. The IPIC report is forward-looking. What are we going to be doing with the impact fee revenue that we project coming in? And the Development Impact Fee Report is an accounting of the funds we've already collected. So that's also a part of your packet today.
Thank you.
Great. So as Supervisor Cohen's opening comments remarked, we've been having the IPIC report since 2008, and this is one of the first years where we have a lot of revenue and progress to report, and I'm very excited about that. Again, the IPIC report comes out of the Planning Department's implementation team, and this is a group of staff, 2 of which are with me today, Adam Barrett and Matt Snyder, that work on making sure that we balance our infrastructure with the planned growth in our plan areas. We also staff the CACs for Eastern Neighborhoods and Market Octavia, and coordinate a lot of the ongoing infrastructure projects. As a reminder, the IPIC works on plan areas. So as the map before you shows, the plan areas that are covered by the IPIC, we don't work in areas that have development agreements or redevelopment agencies. Those are sort of different mechanisms. But these plan areas have been rezoned for new growth, and a lot of that a lot of those plans also include impact fee revenue or new impact fees to cover the infrastructure. The IPIC was established through the city admin code, and this is just a reminder of the many tasks, but generally what we're doing here as a group is bringing all the city agencies together. MTA, DPW, Park Rec, planning heads this effort, and we come up with a 5-year capital plan based on the projected revenue that we understand for each of these plan areas and the goals of the plan. So this is an annual process. Every year we update our understanding of the revenue projections. We meet with the IPIC and the CACs to develop a new recommendation. I present the IPIC report to the Planning Commission, to yourselves, and the Capital Planning Committee. It gets integrated into the capital plan, and then actual decisions are made through the budget process, allocation of impact fee revenue. So just to start, this is in the report, but we are anticipating about $117 million in impact fee revenue across the plan areas over the next 5 years. Eastern Neighborhoods is the largest plan area geographically, also experiencing the most growth and the most impact fee revenue. You'll also notice that there's sort of a bump in fiscal year 18 where you're seeing a lot more revenue. All of our early year revenue is based on projects we actually see in our pipeline. So that's when we expect a lot of projects to be completed, and also you're seeing the tail end of the impact fee deferral program. So that's why there's that big sort of bump in the revenue. What I wanted to do today is just highlight for each plan area some of the major projects and progress. The report you have before you details all of the different decisions and prioritization choices we've made. So Rincon Hill, the first plan area that was adopted in 2005, includes an extensive open space and streetscape improvement plan. There's also a community benefits district that's nearly established to help fund the maintenance of these infrastructure pieces. New this year in Rincon Hill, we recently updated the cost estimates for the entire streetscape improvement plan, and we are scheduled to have a community meeting in the coming spring, I think it was May, to make further decisions about the prioritization within the detailed streetscape plan. Different than of the other area plans, Rincon Hill has a streetscape design for each street and each segment. Some of the other plan areas call for improvements, but the detailed work has yet to be completed. Also, in Rincon Hill, we're really happy to say that the Guy Place Park will be fully funded this year and started construction. We acquired the land many years ago with impact fee revenue, and there was a development slump. We now have the revenue to build the park, and we're really looking forward to seeing that move forward. Market Octavia. Market Octavia is a plan area that covers 4 districts, and it includes sort of the intersection of Market and Octavia. It was made room for about 6,000 new housing units. From a transportation perspective, a lot of progress has been made. The pictures you see here are first of the Dolores and Market Street in-kind improvements. So this is an example of when the developer, rather than paying the impact fee, develops and builds the improvement. And I think it's working quite well at this intersection. And that was an improvement that was called for by the plan area, or by the area plan rather. Also, we used a small amount of impact fee revenue to match 2 major grants, the Haight Street improvement, as well as the Polk Street bicycle counterflow lane. So that's sort of more examples of creative ways to use the impact fee revenue to move the big infrastructure projects along. Also, you know, a lot of the ideas that are called for in the plan area, and as Supervisor Cohen alluded to, the impact fee revenue does not cover all of the needs, and so these are examples of projects that were funded through the sale of the Central Freeway parcels, a new park at McCoppin, the skate park, which is right by our office, and personally I love that the best, just kind of watching all the kids play there, and a dog run. So this is an example of the other kinds of revenue that are really necessary to make the plans full. Eastern Neighborhoods, again, it was the biggest plan area, also has the most infrastructure needs. We're converting some neighborhoods to residential. The 16th Street, as a result of that, when the plan was adopted, the board established what we call the MOU, or the Eastern Neighborhoods MOU, which prioritized, I think, about 10 different infrastructure improvements, some of them small and some of them large. And the planning process really prioritizes funding those. The 16th Street Transportation Improvement, which is bus rapid transit and pedestrian improvements that will link the Mission to Central Waterfront, is one of the major priorities. We're dedicating $14.6 million in impact fee revenue to that project, and the Transportation Task Force has identified revenue to sort of match that to complete the project. Also in Eastern Neighborhoods, our first child care facility funded through area plan impact fees was completed through an in-kind agreement. This is on 3rd and 23rd, I believe. The Potrero Boosters, so the Potrero the Potrero Kids facility. And it's a beautiful facility run by a nonprofit. In Market Octavia, we'll be releasing an RFP for developers or child care facility providers to access the impact fee money in the next year or so to also build a child care facility. And then finally, in Eastern Neighborhoods, is the MOU called for a new park in each of the sub-plan areas, and we have fully funded and expect construction to start on the 17th and Folsom Park in the Mission District. And this was funded through $2.5 million of impact fee revenue and then a state grant that was secured. We also are expecting an in-kind agreement for Daggett Triangle for a new park in the Showplace Square area. Finally, the Rec Park has been working with our CAC to develop a strategy for improvements to many of the existing parks. Visitation Valley also is part of the IPIC, and not a lot of development has happened there since the plan was established. However, the Schleg Lock project, which was adopted in July 2014, has really sort of changed the dynamic out there, and that will generate about $6 million in impact fee revenue. And the department has been working with the community to sort of help prioritize the improvements. A lot of them were defined through the development agreement, but there is also a call for improvements outside of the Schleg Lock site, and so that's what we're working with the community on. The Transit Center District Plan is really different than all the others. We didn't include it in the total because it operates so differently. Basically, sort of the update here is the Melrose has been established in the past year, which helps fund a lot of the infrastructure. Project management for the Transit Center District Plan will be moved to DPW. They'll be staffing up to have someone who can help move the infrastructure projects forward and coordinate with TJPA on the decisions and prioritization. So just before we close, that's usually where I end my presentation in terms of what have we been doing for the past year on IPIC, but new this year and really exciting for me is the Capital Planning Committee's engagement with this work and choice to ask all the agencies to come to the table and come up with not just a 5-year but a 10-year capital plan for each of these areas. And the goal here really is to understand where does the city need to sort of start participating to help match all the impact fee revenue we have. The first thing we did was look at each plan area and say, what do we think will need to support new growth in the next 10 years? We're calling that a constrained capital plan. So that is, the plan has a 20-year vision and it calls for a lot of things. What do we as a city think we're going to accomplish? And then put a dollar amount to that. And I think I alluded to that in Rincon Hill, but we've really gotten a lot more clear about what the costs are for the infrastructure the plans call for. After that, we went through an exercise with each agency, matching the sources they know and can project to supplement the impact fee revenue. So then we sort of have an understanding of what that gap is, and that information will help us as a city start solving the problem. One of my colleagues made this graphic, which just summarizes for Market Octavia and Eastern Neighborhoods what that exercise resulted in. So for impact fee revenue across those two projects over the next 10 years, it's $141 million. Of that, MTA, Park Rec, DPW know of funds or anticipate grants on the order of $236 million, leaving our 10-year gap at $188. And I want to emphasize that that's the 10-year gap because a lot of that is projects 5 years and out where we don't still have a funding strategy in mind, but a lot of that other funding that agencies really understand in the first 5 years may become available in the next 5 years. So with that, staff is available for questions.
No problem. Supervisor Weiner, do you have a question? Please.
Thank you, and thank you for the update. My question isn't about any of the specific plan areas, but it's really just, I think, it's not really a question, it's more stating facts that I think you'll agree with about our citywide impact fees, and particularly the Transit Impact Development Fee, or TIDF. Just for the benefit of the public, the TIDF does not apply at all to any residential development, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So all the units that are going up in so many different parts of the city, if they're not subject to a development agreement that requires those fees, those residential developments are not paying transit impact fees.
Within area plans, they're paying a transportation part of that area plan.
Right, as part of the area plan fee,
yeah.
But in terms
outside of area plans, no.
Right. So if you're building a commercial office building, you're paying the TIDF.
Correct.
But if you're building a residential, you're not.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. And if it's 2 floors of commercial and then 50 floors of residential, you're paying it on the 2 floors of commercial.
That's correct. But again, in certain districts, there are area plan fees will go towards transportation.
Right. Yeah. So there are, and those area plan fees, in terms of the amount of that numerically that's actually going to transportation, it really pales in comparison to the citywide impact fees.
It depends on the district, what the rate is. So in some areas it's fairly comparable, and in others it's not. But, yeah.
Okay. So, for example, in in eastern neighborhoods, we're projecting, it collected $7 million in district impact fees in the 2013-2014 fiscal year. Of that $7 million, how many went to transit? How much went to transit? I think it's de minimis, but I'm curious.
We have in the projections, we have a significant amount going to the 16th Street Transit project, and so we have put a certain amount of money towards sort of the engineering of that in the past, which MTA is working on right now, and we've dedicated. I don't have the number in front of me. It's about 40% of the revenues projected that would actually go to transportation
in the future.
Yeah, which means which is the 16th Street Transit project.
Right.
Yeah.
But of the $7 million that were collected last fiscal year, how much of that was dedicated to transit?
I think what we do with the impact fee revenues is we true up every 5 years. So for eastern neighborhoods, that's the one that has about 30 or 40% going to transit. But I think the point you're trying to make is the citywide experience of contributing to the transportation fund is really only on a residential basis in eastern neighborhoods in Market Octavia. And eastern neighborhoods is about 40% of the total revenue, and Market Octavia is about 20 or 30%.
And if you have a project in eastern neighborhoods or Market Octavia, and you're paying the impact fees for those zones, the Market Octavia fees, eastern neighborhood fees, does that replace, or is it in addition to the citywide fees for affordable housing, childcare, transit, et cetera?
They're all in addition to any citywide fee. That's correct. So they're all paying at a much higher rate than anywhere outside of a plan area.
Right, but it's in addition to, and so I understand that there are these zone impact fees, that some of which go to transit, but it is not a replacement. And I do think that in the end, if transit impact development fee, the citywide fee applied to residential, my sense is it would absolutely dwarf what the Market Octavia or Eastern Neighborhoods zones produce for transit. Would you agree with that?
I'd have to look at the numbers, but in terms of geography, that's certainly true. The map I showed you at the beginning of the presentation shows which areas pay the fees right now, and it doesn't cover half. I think it's a quarter of the city.
And if you look at the development that's going on in the city right now, do you have a sense for what percentage of that development is residential versus non-residential?
That is a great question. We do have a sense of by a project basis, but not by a per square foot. So by and large, residential is...
I'll bet it's overwhelmingly residential.
That's correct.
Okay, because you
Yes.
typically don't build commercial above maybe the second floor at the highest, except for specifically
Downtown.
office building. Yeah.
Sure.
And so I guess my point is we're leaving an enormous amount of money on the table. And you look at the citywide transit impact development fee for 2013-2014, which was the explosive year. All the impact fees went up last fiscal year, not surprisingly, given the development in the city. And so we collected $12.5 million for the transit impact development fee. You compare that to $40 million for affordable housing. And it's great that we're collecting $40 million for affordable housing. I'm 1,000% support that. We need more. But it shows how deprioritized transit funding is in this city. And I think it's, frankly, ridiculous and unsupportable that the TIDF doesn't apply to residential. I know that's not your decision. That's the decision of this Board of Supervisors and the mayor, and I look forward to eliminating that exemption because it shouldn't exist.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Supervisor Kim.
Thank you, Chair Cohen, and thank you so much for the presentation. And it's also great to see the successes that we've accomplished with the using the fees to help fund many of these open space transportation projects, as well as what is in the what else is in the plans. I had a couple of questions. I'm starting actually with the Rincon Hill, and I know that this was the first program to start looking at an impact fee structure. And I would like to talk a little bit, this is a neighborhood that in some ways it feels like we're building from the ground up. There wasn't a lot of infrastructure there, and we're putting a lot of primarily residential buildings in that neighborhood, and of course to the north of it, a mixed commercial residential neighborhood with transit center district plan. And now that we're in place and development is happening, we're of course finding that there is a tremendous need of infrastructure in this area, yet a gap exists between the impact fees and, of course, the non-impact fee sources for the capital improvements. The economy has exploded in this area over the last 5 years, and much more development, especially high-end development, is occurring in this area. And we're finding that the median home prices for condos are way above $1 million a unit. And so I'm curious why we're not charging the maximum nexus amount for recreation and open space, for example. We have a lot of need for open space in the area, and it's significantly, well, actually both Market Octavia and Rincon Hill are significantly lower than Eastern Neighborhoods fees, for example, and the thought process behind.
Sure. So, sort of the origin of all the impact fees came with the plan. So with the plan, we looked at what the value of the land was at the time, and then what value the city was conferring through the redevelopment. And we wanted to set the impact fees sort of at a point where we were sure that the housing and office space that we were calling for would move forward, and we'd be able to also fund a reasonable amount of infrastructure. Rincon Hill is different than a lot of the other area plans that when we adopted the plan, we had this belief that we were going to be able to fund 100% of the infrastructure with the impact fee revenue. Part of that was not a clear understanding on all the costs around implementing the infrastructure. And then part of it was sort of the value that was conferred, the type of construction which you alluded to could support sort of a more generous fee. As you know, there are two area-specific fee programs there. There's the Rincon Hill fee, which is what we're talking about today, and the Stillman stabilization fee. And when you look at those together, you see a much higher fee rate per square foot than when you're comparing it to, say, Eastern Neighborhoods or Market Octavia. So with each plan area, we did a needs assessment, a nexus study, and then also a feasibility analysis to sort of match all of those things together.
So I understand that, and I know that we have a maximum nexus that we don't necessarily kind of hit with all of our fees, because we also want to make sure that development and construction is feasible. But given what we're seeing now with sales of units in that area, are we reconsidering the fee assessment, because what we're hearing a lot, and I know you've heard this too, but what we hear so much from that neighborhood is just their thirst for infrastructure, open space transit, and of course our cost of construction is going up as well with the boom in development, because we're competing with private developers for the same kind of universe or finite universe of construction workers and construction companies. And so now that we kind of have a better sense of what developers are able to bring in per unit, do you think it'd be appropriate to reconsider the nexus for a number of these? And of course, the child care fee was set at 0. And I know this was the first program to go, and we do have the SOMA Stabilization Fund. But with the feasibility, would it be appropriate to relook at those fees given the dollars that are coming in?
Yeah, what we are trying to do is kind of have the decisions made within the community planning process. So this citywide look at, the nexus, which is the next item, or how we spend the money at this item, that's not a thing the department took on. But I will say we do as much as we can to make the program sensitive and responsive to the market. So you mentioned something about our rising costs, and a couple of years ago we added an index to all of our impact fees so that when the revenue is collected, we're doing the best to capture the value it will cost the city to build the infrastructure. So we are getting there, but I do think you're pointing out that impact fees are sort of a clumsy tool. They're not as responsive to the ups and downs of the real estate market. Mm-hmm. So I think I hear what you're saying there.
Yeah, I think we've certainly heard from folks that we want to relook at that, and also to take into account now that we have a sense of what residential units are now selling for. I know it's different, like you said, for every area plan. Certain residential units aren't going to command the same level of revenue that others are, but we're certainly seeing really high home sales in Rincon Hill area, and I think our residents would certainly like to see developers put more of that back into the infrastructure for the residents that are moving into the neighborhood. I had another question about, I was noticing, this is actually just in the biennial report, and I know this is through the Controller's Office, but I was wondering if you might be able to address this question. It's just on the first page, on page 3 with the development impact fee revenue summary. I noticed that with Market Octavia, Eastern Neighborhoods, and the C3 district, that even though there hasn't been an increase in projects between fiscal year 2012-2013 and fiscal year 2013-2014, for example, Market Octavia had 13 in year 1, 12 in year 2, yet the impact fees almost tripled that year. And I was curious, was it that that developers had been building smaller projects in fiscal year 2012-2013? Or this may be an appropriate question for the Controller's Office.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Drew Morrell from the Controller's Office. To some extent, we can speak to that. We can look into more specifics as needed. But I have attributed that to somewhat the value of the projects in those years, as well as the sunsetting of the fee deferral program, I think combined to create a more valuable impact fee collection.
So, and that's solely, it's not necessarily the size of the project, it's really just the increase in value. That's really amazing. And I just pointing it out for members of the public that can't see, for example, in Market Octavia, 13 units were built in fiscal year 2012, and it brought in $2.7 million. In fiscal year 2013, 12 projects were built, one less, and it brought in $7.8 million. So that's just attributed to the value of those projects going up over one fiscal year, primarily.
I would say primarily, but to actually get it down to specifics, we would need to look at it a little bit more, which we're happy to do.
Okay, great. And just back to the planning department, what is do we look at the index because it's far below the rising costs of construction?
So there's a process explained in I forget if it's the admin code or the planning code on how we establish that index, and it's established every year, and it's a blend of the cost of construction and the municipal interest rate. So it's to reflect how perhaps we would be holding the money in a municipal account and raising interest, and then also the cost of construction. And the capital planning committee is responsible for determining that interest rate annually, so that's kind of how it's established.
Okay. I think that, our office is certainly interested in working on updating the fees, and we appreciate the nexus analysis. And I want to appreciate the balance between both what we could charge and what the nexus would allow us to charge for infrastructure costs with feasibility of construction, because we certainly don't want to hamper or dampen the feasibility side. But I think, we would like to see balance, because as we see the value of what is being created and what developers are raking in terms of profits per unit, as our newer residents move in and the existing residents that exist there, I think there's frustration when the infrastructure doesn't match what our residents would expect of a neighborhood through complete streets, childcare, and open space. And I know that that's not just on the planning department, but it's something that our office, because that is a policy question, but it's something that our office is very interested in pursuing with the planning department.
Great.
Is that it? Okay, good. I've got a couple questions. So while I'm most interested in the Potrero Hill and the Central Waterfront, I'm sure Supervisor Kim is interested in the other parts of the Eastern Neighborhood areas that touch her specific district. What is the current funding gap for the identified Eastern Neighborhood infrastructure projects? Supervisor Weiner kind of touched base on it a little bit, but I was wondering if you could just tell us what that figure is.
So the last slide before you shows Market Octavia and Eastern Neighborhoods together. I'm not sure that we have the number that's for Eastern Neighborhoods specific for over the 10-year period, but I think it's fair to imagine that of that $188 million, a bigger share is Eastern Neighborhoods, because that's the bigger plan area, and we do know it's $44 million.
Thank you very much.
So, sorry. So the funding gap for Eastern Neighborhoods is $44 million over the 10-year period. Oh, sorry. I see what you're saying. So the funding gap is $44 million, but when we include sort of a larger pool of projects, the funding gap for Eastern Neighborhoods, so of the $188 million, it's $140 million for the entire Eastern Neighborhoods. That doesn't make sense because we were working with the Capital Planning Committee. Let me just unpack that and restate it. So basically, this slide that we're looking at that says we've identified $141 million in impact fee revenue and $236 in other funds. Then there's $188 million gap. There's a gap. And of that, about $140 million is in the Eastern Neighborhoods, and about the remaining 44 would be in Market Octavia. So that's what we need over a 10-year period to complete what the departments and agencies feel is achievable and realistic to support the new growth in 10 years is $140 million in Eastern Neighborhoods.
Okay, so let me see. So we have a funding gap of $188 million, period.
Yes.
44 of that $188 million gap, 44 million of it belongs in Market Octavia.
That's correct.
And the remainder is in Eastern Neighborhoods?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, I shouldn't say Eastern yes, in Eastern Neighborhoods. Okay. Okay, thank you. Wow, that's a lot of money. So, another thing I want to talk a little bit about are what are some of the other options that the city has done to evaluate this funding gap? So, what are some of the ideas being generated to fill this gap?
I think the most recent effort is the effort that I'm presenting before you. So that was really taking a look at all of the city agencies and understanding, the way, and this is my retelling of it, but the way MTA operates is they know about a lot of federal dollars, state dollars that are coming in, and they program them at sort of a high level, like programmatic level. And so this conversation we're having with them is to help direct that programmatic level lining for future funds that aren't already affiliated with a project somewhere else in the city towards this gap. And so that's really what it is looking at all the funding we know about, maybe, and starting to direct it where we're seeing this growth. I mean, I think the sort of novelty for me working with the IPIC was learning that a lot of our agencies operate on assuming this a stayed state for the city. And so introducing this conversation of we're growing a lot of housing in eastern neighborhoods, you really need to do infrastructure planning with that in mind, has been really the work of the IPIC over the past couple of years. And I think this very beautiful but abbreviated chart is the beginning of that conversation where the agencies really are starting to look at their long understood sources and direct them where growth is happening.
Okay. So can you outline for me where the various Eastern neighborhood infrastructure improvements are in the capital plan? And I'm particularly interested in their priority level.
Well, within the capital plan, there's two different ways that we treat the IPIC projects. First is any project that we think is full or nearly funded. We take that and we put that in the agency's budget. So now Park Rec is responsible for moving 17th and Folsom forward, or MTA is responsible for moving the 16th Street transportation project forward. So those are projects that have clear and identified funding strategies. Then there's what we call, I think we call it emerging needs still, which means the area plan calls for it. We think that we have impact fee money for it, but maybe we don't have a lot or enough, but we know the city's committed to accomplishing it in the next 5-10 years. So it stays in the capital plan and it shows up as an emerging need. So the city's it's on our books as something that we need to accomplish, but it hasn't been tethered to a specific agency's budget.
All right. So currently the mayor's office has a role in setting the citywide priorities and making decisions on what projects move forward for competitive grant funding. And I believe that our office, well, I know our office is acutely dialed into with the neighbors talking and through discussion about what they're experiencing in these neighborhoods as their needs, as they would articulate it, are going unmet. So I was wondering if there's any other representation from the mayor's office besides the budget office or any other supervisorial offices that are watching this process?
Participating in the IPIC itself?
Yes.
We have the mayor's budget office at the committee, but we do informational presentations. I think we've met with most supervisors throughout the year as these issues come up. And the Eastern Neighborhood CAC meets monthly. Matt Snyder, who's here, staffs it. And I believe twice a year you go to the community? They hold community meetings regularly to sort of bring this conversation outside of just the CAC.
Okay.
But regularly, like once or twice annually.
Okay.
To sort of reach that spot.
Okay. I have no further questions, and I see my colleagues don't have any other questions, so let's go ahead. Oh, Supervisor Kim has a question.
Sorry, just one more question that I forgot to ask. This is about the funding gap that you referred to in your last slide. And I was wondering if the funding gap for both Eastern Neighborhoods and Market Octavia, does it account for new levels of services as well, and the Nexus capacity in the new Nexus analysis? With the growth in the neighborhood.
I think your question is, how do we define that need?
Yeah.
And the way I describe it sort of at a high level is the area plans call for reaching the service level that we're at now with the new population. And so we tried to figure out, in the next 10 years, what level of population will we have and what level of infrastructure will we need to serve that level of population. So in summary, yes. And we chose both sort of using the Nexus analysis as a way to filter that, and then also working with the agency experts to sort of balance that out with real projects.
So the Nexus analysis does include kind of new levels of service that we've seen as there's growth in the neighborhood?
That's correct. That's the fundamentals, yep.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's move into public comment. Are there any members of the public that would like to comment on item number 1? Seeing none, public comment is closed. Okay, colleagues, given that this is an annual item, I'd like to make a motion that we file this hearing.
Motion to file?
Thank you very much. Motion to file, seconded by Supervisor Kim. I guess, could you call a roll call vote on the item number 1?
You would
motion
like a
to file?
roll call?
Yes.
You like a roll call vote?
Yes, please.
Okay, sure. I'm sorry. Supervisor Kim.
Aye.
Kim, aye. Supervisor Weiner. Weiner, aye. And Chair Cohen.
Thank you. Aye.
You have 3 ayes.
Thank you very much. Okay. This item has been dealt with. This item has been motioned to file. Madam Clerk, could you please call item number 2?
Yes, item number 2 is an ordinance amending the planning code to adopt the Nexus Analyst supporting existing development fees.
Thank you very much. The Planning Department is a sponsor of this item and will present. Welcome back.
Supervisors, Kirsten Dissinger, here to talk to you about impact fees. So this afternoon, I'm here to present legislation that was adopted by our Planning Commission on December 11th. We're calling it the Citywide Nexus Analysis legislation, and I think we've already had a really good conversation on a lot of these topics, but I'll just reframe for you what we're doing today. So we completed a citywide Nexus study. It's a requirement of the state that you update Nexus studies every 5 years. As I described before, each of our area plans had its own separate Nexus study. In an effort to make this program easier to administer, we decided to generate a citywide Nexus analysis that covers all of the plan areas and the entire city. It sets standards rather than having a list of goods. So it's a standards-based approach to establishing the relationship between new residential and non-residential development and new infrastructure. I want to make really clear this Nexus study does not look at transit, which is being studied in a separate effort, and it does not look at affordable housing, which is also covered by a separate Nexus analysis. So we're talking about transportation, meaning streetscapes and bicycles, and open space and recreation facilities and childcare facilities within the framework of this. So the legislation before you today, as I said, was adopted by the Planning Commission on December 11th, and it does basically one main thing, which is it updates the references in the different fees to this new analysis, so validating that these fees are within the legally mandated maximum limit. But we also took this chance to sort of clean up how the fees operate. So there's a few administrative cleanups, and we made only one change to the expenditures, and that is removing libraries. The reason we did that is we have completed the branch library improvement program, and in agreement with the library, we felt that it made more sense to direct that 1% roughly of each plan area to streetscape improvements rather than libraries. Also, we did not change first the fee rates, which we just discussed, nor have we changed the geographies. So a lot of people heard the citywide Nexus analysis. I want to make it really clear that we didn't change. The Eastern Neighborhoods fees are still expended in Eastern Neighborhoods. Market Octavia are still expended within Market Octavia. And so finally, we did present this analysis and this legislation to the Eastern Neighborhoods and the Market Octavia CACs, and we had full support from them as well. And staff are available for questions on this too.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for that presentation. Let's see. Colleagues, are there any questions on item number 2? No? Okay. I just want to ask a couple questions. So on page 12 of your report, it states, quote, the Nexus study assumes that the city will fund 100% of the development-based demands for open space through the fee, end quote. How is this statement correct, given that in our previous item we heard that there were continuous gaps, continues to be gaps in funding needed, particularly for our open space in the Eastern Neighborhoods created by an increased population?
I'm trying to catch up to your question. Is
sure.
That
on page 12
in the report?
In the report. The Nexus study report.
Okay. So what I think it might be referencing, and I'll just kind of talk through it, and maybe you can help me if I'm missing your question, but the way we establish the maximum Nexus amount, you can imagine the question of how much park do you need per person is kind of abstract, and that's sort of a policy question. We'd probably all answer it differently. What we decided to say is what we'll cap the total amount on is what we think, if Park Rec can sort of keep a service level for our existing population at just 1 square foot of park per person, then we'll set sort of the nexus there. So we use the understood revenues of Park Rec to service the existing population as sort of the way to mediate this conversation about what what amount is the appropriate top. There's a legal reason we chose that, though, and that is basically we can't ask the developers to provide 2 square feet of park per person when the city itself is only going to be able to deliver 1. So we have to make sure that whatever standard we're holding the developers to, we can also deliver. That's correct.
So so basically the statement's true if we adapt the maximum allowable fee, which is listed in tables 5 and 6, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. So if any of the incentives we do provide to developers, what if any incentives do we provide to developers if any choose to build child care facilities on site? So what are the incentives? Yeah.
Yeah. So, building childcare on site is really complicated. There's a lot of special needs for childcare facilities in terms of access to yards and fire safety and earthquake safety considerations. So the planning department has been working really closely with HSA, Graham Dobson, and Marty Lusich before him on understanding what those spaces are. And we kind of have a checklist that we provide to developers to kind of start that conversation about whether their property is appropriate and works for that. But as we showed in the Potrero Kids site, which is the Potrero Launch Project, the developer was able to seek an in-kind agreement. So rather than paying their impact fee,
Right.
they were able to just provide the space rent-free to a nonprofit operator.
So I'm wondering if that's something that we can begin to do on a regular basis. So we've got projects that are happening, some of the residential projects happening in the eastern neighborhoods that are going to have over 300 units, and a child care facility would be a great amenity. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the requirement in terms of space, that's a statewide issue, is it not?
That's correct.
And it's regulated on the state level.
That's correct.
Okay, so in order to make any kind of changes to that, we'd have to appeal to our legislators up in Sacramento. Has there been an effort to do that?
This is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. I understand enough to know that the guiding principles to that are making sure that if you have 5 small children or 10 small children, they can safely get between the play area and the fire exits. So I don't know that the licensing conversation is going in that direction. I think it's more from our work with HSA is around identifying really early on the sites that could make that work. There's some flexibility, I think, around in using private yards, like maybe it's the open space at night for the residents, and during the day it's the play area for the children. And that's a conversation where we have more local control. Say the operators of the building can make that choice, and we can participate in that conversation. That's the latest that I've heard on that.
Okay. Well, needless to say, I just certainly want to go on the record, but it's quite an amenity that would be greatly, that would fill a great need. We've got a lot of families that are moving into the neighborhoods, and childcare, I used to sit on the First Five Commission, and that is an asset to a neighborhood that we just don't have enough of. And another added benefit is that it activates the ground floor retail space in a very positive way. So there's foot traffic, it's fun, you get laughter, it's just nice. So I also want to touch base on the report. It acknowledges the continued challenge that we have in our city funding adequate child care slots for all of our city's children. Just based on some preliminary budget conversations that I've had with child care advocates, we have at least a $500,000 need for capital improvements to existing child care facilities, many of which are outside of the planned areas, as well as at least a $2.5 million need to expand the number of available slots for infants and toddlers. So given that the need for new child care facilities is not as pressing as the need for subsidies for child care slots, and improvements to existing facilities what improvements to existing facilities has there been any conversation about expanding the use of some of these fees or creating a different mechanism to where developers can help offset the city's need through any other ways? I know that's a really long and convoluted question.
I think I followed.
Okay, good.
So maybe it's the beautiful room. But so basically, there is a limitation to the idea that you just put forward, which, if I heard correctly, was can we use impact fee money to remedy our existing deficits? And across the board, and sort of this goes back to that legal requirement, we're only able to ask the developers to contribute for the demand that they're creating, so the new demand. So impact fee revenue is pretty flexible, but it is limited in terms of it needs to be around creating new capacity, additional capacity, and meeting that new demand. So in the case of childcare facilities, say you have an existing facility that currently services 25 children, you could use impact fee revenue to expand the capacity of that program to 50 or 100 children, but you couldn't use it to do maintenance on the roof and then maintain that level of service. So we have been working closely with HSA. I think there's a limitation on operators and then available space. So this expansion idea, I think, is something we hope to see in the Market Octavia plan area. I think I mentioned earlier, we're putting out an RFP that says, hey, childcare community, here's X million dollars. You need to service a certain number of children more with this, and then that leaves it to the providers to kind of solve that problem.
Okay, final question. It stems more around, again, around impact fees. I heard you say in the presentation that it's kind of a clunky tool, right? It doesn't necessarily, it's not quick to respond to the changing dynamics of the market. One of the things that I've heard consistently from constituents is a desire to increase impact fees. And I'm curious to know if the board can make changes to these fees.
So the development impact fees live in the planning code. So they are, amendable through legislative process like any other part of the planning code. The legal limit, of course, would be the nexus analysis. And then sort of behind that, and I think this is sort of the heart of why the department chose to keep this legislation focused on just updating the existing program, is we were trying to keep intact the community planning process. So that involved the community and the stakeholders. So the negotiation around what that fee rate was and what it covers. I think we were talking earlier about how some more money goes to transit in some plan areas than others. That was a decision that was made through a very long community planning process.
Yes.
So those would be the kinds of considerations, I think, around fee changes. And I think we've talked extensively about feasibility analysis and kind of understanding, what the long-term and short-term goals are and the trade-offs that the city would like to make.
So in our current market, the rate of return for developers, it's increasing. And our current fee structure doesn't allow us to capture any of this new value. And that's concerning, particularly when you think about the large gap that we have. How do we reconcile this?
Well, if we existed outside of the state of California, we would have this property tax tool. And I think you could argue that if these new units are selling at that rate, we're capturing it a little bit in that way. But I've been thinking this question over. I had an idea it might come up. And I really think that it might be a supplemental tool that captures that sort of difference at the sale end. I think because development process takes multiple years, you don't really know where a particular project would end. But we assess the fees when they hit entitlement, which they're not going to be constructed for multiple years later. We don't understand the distortion of the market in 2-3 years, or even 6 months, it turns out. So I'm wondering, I guess, what other tools to think about, and maybe it's something at the sales end or later in the process.
Fantastic, thank you. So I generally think that the nexus analysis, like what you've presented today, it's important because it gives us as policymakers the tools, the data, but more importantly, a framework to begin to address some of our infrastructure needs. So I appreciate your presentation. I see Supervisor Kim has a question, and then we'll take public comment.
Thank you. I just wanted to connect to some of the points that Supervisor Cohen made, because I think express some of the same concerns that I have, is the growing kind of value of our real estate and what we're actually seeing in sales, and our nexus capacity today. And I would be very interested in working with planning and again in Supervisor Cohen's office on relooking at raising some of our citywide nexus fee, balancing both feasibility and the actual cost of infrastructure. Regarding what you just said about capturing the tax increment, I know that that we do have one tool in Rincon Hill, even as I bring it up, that we're considering to cover some of the gap, I know, with Harrison Street and some of our other needs in the area, and that is that we have in place the Rincon Hill IFD, which does allow us to capture some of the increment to cover the gap. And it's a more accurate sense of the property value because we get it through the property taxes and the rise in property tax value in that area. And I'm not sure if that's something, I think it could be a model for other neighborhoods. I'm not sure if it's being considered in other neighborhoods as well, but it certainly would be helpful in helping us to cover the gap because we need to build the infrastructure. The residents expect it, and we certainly should be providing it as we encourage people to move into those areas and live in transit-rich neighborhoods.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Supervisor Weiner. Nothing? Okay, perfect. Let's go ahead and move to public comment on this item. And seeing no public comment, public comment is closed. Colleagues, I'd love to entertain a motion on this item.
Move to forward to the board with positive recommendation.
Thank you very much. The motion has been made to forward with a positive recommendation. Let's do a roll call vote on this motion.
Okay. All right. Supervisor Cohen?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Supervisor Kim?
Aye.
Kim, aye. Supervisor Weiner?
Aye.
Weiner, aye. And Chair Cohen.
All right, thank you very much. This motion passes. This item is going to the full board with positive recommendation. Thank you, planning staff. Okay, Madam Clerk, could you please call item number 3?
Item number 3 is an ordinance amending the planning code to permit off-street parking exceptions.
All right, thank you. So the colleagues, this request came in by Supervisor Breed. She's asking us to continue this item for 1 week to our April 6th meeting. But before we take up that motion, first let me ask if there are any members of the public who'd like to speak on item number 3. Okay, seeing no public comment. Public comment is closed at this point. Can I have a motion to continue this item for 1 week? Thank you very much. This motion is made by Supervisor Kim. Thank you very much. This item will be tabled to the next meeting.
April 6th.
April 6th. Thank you, Madam Clerk. Are there any other items before this body today?
There's no further business.
All right, thank you. There's no further business. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.